My father married a gold digger 2 years before he passed away, and now she's trying to take over his estate, completely oblivious to who it really belongs to. Here's the thing, my father is going into hospice next week. It's been a chaotic time. I knew this day would come, but that doesn't make it any easier. The key issue is that the house he's been living in with his wife, Sandy, and her 2 daughters, Tina and Beth, isn't even his. It's mine. I bought it years ago, but you'd never guess that from their behavior. But let me start from the beginning. About 7 years ago, after my mother passed away, my father's life took a nosedive. They'd been together for over 30 years, and her death hit him hard. It was difficult for all of us, but my father was devastated. Within a few months, he lost his job and couldn't afford the rent on his apartment, so he was evicted. It felt like everything was falling apart in an instant, and he had no one else to turn to but me. Being the only child who could help, I bought him a house. Nothing fancy, just a small place in a quiet, older neighborhood. It wasn't glamorous, but it was safe, and more importantly, it gave him shelter when he desperately needed it. He also had his dog, Charlie, who, frankly, was his last connection to my mother. That dog was like family to us. It made the whole situation a little less bleak. For the first couple of years, things were all right. My father slowly started to get back on his feet, and the house became his little sanctuary. He was trying his best to rebuild his life after such a blow, and Charlie was always there with him. I used to visit him every weekend, it became our routine. Charlie would go crazy wagging his tail whenever I showed up, and we'd grill burgers in the backyard, chat, and try to enjoy life again after everything we'd been through. Then Sandy entered my father's life. They met through some mutual friends and got married pretty quickly. I wasn't opposed to it, if it made him happy, and Sandy seemed nice enough at first, polite, always smiling, and seemed to genuinely care for my father. So when he told me Sandy was moving in, I didn't object. It was his life, after all, and as long as he was happy, that was enough for me. But this is where things started to get a little weird. First, it was just Sandy moving in, which was fine. Then, out of nowhere, her daughter, Tina, showed up with all her belongings, like she was moving in too. Tina was in her 20s, a grown adult, so she wasn't some kid needing a place to crash for the weekend. She was staying. I didn't say anything because, again, it was my father's life, and I wanted to respect that. But it was still a bit odd, wasn't it? A few months went by, and I started to notice things. Every time I visited, there were more and more of Sandy's things, and the house, which once felt like my father's place, now felt more like hers. Even though I kept telling myself that as long as my father was happy, it was okay, things were definitely changing. Just when I thought things couldn't get any more crowded, the younger daughter, Beth, moved in as well. Now you had Sandy, Tina, Beth, and my father all living in one house. You can imagine what that was like. At first, I tried not to let it bother me. It was strange seeing my father's home slowly being taken over by Sandy and her daughters, but what could I do? I wasn't going to tell my father how to live his life. But things started to escalate. The atmosphere in the house shifted dramatically, and it seemed like my father's opinion no longer mattered. Everything revolved around Sandy and her daughters. Things had already been going downhill with Sandy and her daughters slowly taking over my father's house, and then, just when I thought things couldn't get any more irritating, we had the whole mess with Charlie. Let me explain about Charlie. He wasn't just a pet, Charlie was family. My mother loved that dog like he was her own child, and after she passed away, Charlie became my father's emotional anchor. He was the only thing he could really rely on after everything that had happened. I know some people won't understand, but if you've ever had a dog, you know what I mean. So you can imagine how furious I was when Beth, the youngest daughter, started complaining about Charlie. Seriously, Charlie was old and harmless. He spent 90% of his day sleeping or chasing his tail, but one day, Beth just casually mentioned that Charlie made her uncomfortable. She said she felt unsafe around him. I'm not one to dismiss someone's fears, but come on, this was Charlie, not some rabid wolf. The guy was 12 years old and needed a rest just to climb the stairs, and he was about as dangerous as a pillow. I didn't take it seriously at first, thinking she was just exaggerating, but of course, Sandy jumped in to back her up, making a huge fuss about how maybe it was time for Charlie to find a new home, like he was some unwanted piece of furniture that needed to be thrown out. That was my breaking point. I could see how much stress this was causing my father. He wasn't just being asked to give up a dog, he was being asked to give up his last real connection to my mother. It broke my heart to see him like that, but what could I do? I didn't live there, and Sandy had pretty much taken over all the decision-making in the house. I knew my father didn't want to give up Charlie, but he was tired, he was dealing with his own health issues, and I guess he just didn't have the energy to fight anymore. So, yeah, I intervened. I straight up told my father that Charlie could come live with me. I wasn't going to let Sandy or her daughters bully him into giving up that dog. My father was relieved, but I could tell he was still heartbroken. I mean, he didn't want to give up Charlie, but he knew it was the only way to stop the constant arguments in the house. Sandy acted like she was doing him a huge favor by letting me take Charlie, but I knew that wasn't the case at all. It wasn't about Charlie, it was about control. She and her daughters wanted to be the ones calling all the shots, and Charlie was just another way of pushing my father out of the decision-making process in his own home. From that day on, every time I visited, I brought Charlie with me, and it was like I was bringing some kind of dangerous animal into the house. Tina and Beth would practically scream every time they saw him, like Charlie was about to attack them. The first time I brought him home after all that, Beth literally screamed when she saw him, as if she hadn't been living with this dog for the past few years. Sandy tried to play it cool, but you could see her rolling her eyes every time I walked through the door with Charlie. It was ridiculous. Charlie would trot in, wagging his little tail, barely even noticing them, and all they could do was complain about how terrifying he was. I'd sit with my father in the backyard, like we always did, with Charlie lying in the grass, not bothering a soul, and yet, every so often, Beth or Tina would peek out the window, give us a disgusted look, and then run away, like they were escaping some kind of attack dog. Honestly, I think they just hated that Charlie was still around because it was a reminder that this was my father's house, not theirs. Charlie was a part of my father's life, a part of my mother's life, and no matter how hard they tried to take over, Charlie was a constant reminder that they hadn't completely pushed my father out. But then one day, Sandy finally said what I knew was coming. She demanded that I stop bringing Charlie over. I was furious. I asked her why. Charlie hadn't done anything, he was just sitting there. She tried to play it off, saying that Beth was still uncomfortable and it would be better if Charlie just didn't come around anymore. I saw right through it. It wasn't about Charlie at all, it was about power. She and her daughters had been slowly chipping away at everything that was important to my father, and now they wanted to get rid of the last remaining link to his past life. I was so angry, but I didn't want to upset my father any more than he already was. He was sick, and I didn't want to put him through any more stress. So I just flat out told Sandy that Charlie was staying, he wasn't hurting anyone, and if she didn't like it, then she could just not be around when I visited. She didn't like that one bit, but I didn't back down. I knew she wanted to push it further, but I didn't give her the chance. From then on, I brought Charlie with me every time I visited, and I didn't care what they thought. My father deserved at least that much. The tension in the house got even worse after that. It felt like Sandy and her daughters were just waiting for my father to pass away so they could take over completely. I could see the way they treated him, like he was just some old guy taking up space. But as long as I and Charlie were around, they couldn't completely push him out. Now my father is going into hospice, and I've seen the signs. They think they're going to get the house. They think everything will be theirs once he's gone. But they're in for a surprise. This is still my house, and Charlie will outlive them all. With my father going into hospice, I know time is running out to say a proper goodbye. It's something I've been dreading, but I can't put it off any longer. He's not doing well, and I need to see him, especially since I've been taking care of Charlie ever since Sandy and her daughters basically forced him out. I want to bring Charlie to see my father one last time, to give them a moment together before everything goes downhill. When I arrived at the house with Charlie, Sandy, Tina, and Beth were already there. I could feel the tension in the room as soon as I walked in with Charlie. You know that feeling when you walk into a place and everyone just stops what they're doing? Yeah, it was like that. The atmosphere was thick, but I didn't care. I was there to see my father, not them. Tina was the first to speak, wrinkling her nose at Charlie and saying, "Oh great, he brought that mutt again." She didn't even try to hide her attitude. She acted like Charlie was some wild beast. But the truth was, Charlie was so old at this point he barely moved unless you tempted him with a treat or something. But there she was, acting like the dog was going to destroy the house. I took a deep breath and ignored her. I wasn't about to start an argument right then and there, even though I could feel my blood boiling. I just said, "I'm here to see Dad," and walked straight to his room. I heard Sandy mutter something to Beth, but I didn't catch all of it. Probably some passive-aggressive comment about me or the dog, but whatever. I didn't have the energy to deal with them. When I got to my father's room, he was lying in bed, looking frail but still awake. The moment he saw me and Charlie trot in, tail wagging like crazy, a smile spread across his face for the first time in weeks. It was in that moment I realized how much my father had missed Charlie. Charlie immediately jumped up on the bed, which was a real struggle for him at his age, but he managed it. He curled up right next to my father, like they hadn't missed a day. My father reached down and scratched Charlie behind the ears, just like he used to. For a few minutes, it felt like everything was normal again. I could see how much peace Charlie brought my father just by being there. We didn't say much at first. It was one of those moments where words weren't needed, you know? I just sat by his side with Charlie nestled between us, and we just stayed like that for a while. I could tell my father was much weaker than the last time I'd seen him. It was painful to see him like that, but at the same time, it was a relief to see him happy again, at least for those brief moments. After a while, my father spoke. "I've missed this old fella," he said, his voice a little raspy but still with that familiar warmth. "It's good to see him again." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak without choking up. I didn't want to show how emotional I was getting, so I just reached down and patted Charlie's head. We talked for a while about simple things, reminiscing, sharing stories about Charlie, old family memories from when Mom was still alive. It felt good, but it was also bittersweet. I kept thinking that this might be the last time I'd see my father like this, coherent. It's hard to wrap your head around, even when you know it's coming. And then, of course, Sandy had to ruin it. Just as I was about to leave, she walked in, without even knocking. She glanced at Charlie lying on the bed next to my father and immediately looked annoyed. "I thought I told you not to bring that dog in here," she said, crossing her arms and glaring at me like I'd committed some terrible crime. I felt the anger rising in me again, but I kept my cool. "Charlie's not hurting anyone," I said, keeping my voice steady. "He's here to say goodbye to Dad." "Great," Beth chimed in from behind her mother, muttering loudly, "I'll be glad when we don't have to deal with him anymore." That was it. I'd had enough. I stood up, trying to remain calm, but it wasn't easy. "You know what?" I said. "I don't care what you think about Charlie. He's family, and he's staying as long as I'm here. If you don't like it, then that's too bad." Sandy looked like she wanted to argue, but my father cut her off. "It's all right," he said softly. "Let them be." His voice was gentle, but firm, and Sandy didn't push it any further. I stayed a little longer, mostly to make sure my father and Charlie had enough time together, but eventually, I had to leave. I knew this might be the last time I brought Charlie over, and I wanted it to end on a good note. As I walked out, Tina was sitting in the living room scrolling through her phone, barely even looking up as I passed, but just as I was about to walk out the door, she said, "I can't wait until I never have to see that dog again." I stopped, turned around, just stared at her for a second, trying to decide if I really wanted to engage, but then I just said, "You won't have to," and walked out. I didn't need to give them any more of my time. On the drive home, I kept thinking about how wrong all of this was. It wasn't just about Charlie, it was about everything, about how my father's house had been turned into something else, about how Sandy and her daughters had taken over, about how they didn't seem to care at all about my father's declining health. It felt like they were just waiting for him to die so they could move on with their lives. But they were in for a rude awakening. This house wasn't theirs, and they were about to find that out. Update 1. After that last visit with my father, I knew something had to change. I couldn't keep tiptoeing around Sandy and her daughters, letting them act like they owned the place while I just stood by. My father was getting worse, and it was only a matter of time. And once that time came, I knew Sandy and her daughters would expect to stay in the house indefinitely, just like they had been doing for years. I wasn't going to let that happen. But before I revealed to them that the house was mine, I decided to take things one step at a time. First, I needed to gauge their reaction to the idea of paying rent. Maybe, just maybe, they would show some sense of responsibility and agree. But I wasn't holding my breath. So a few days after that emotional visit with my father, I went back to the house. I walked in, and as usual, Sandy, Tina, and Beth were lounging around in the living room like they owned the place. They were watching some reality show on TV, laughing away, which really ticked me off. My father was in hospice, and they were acting like everything was fine. I took a deep breath and walked into the room. Tina glanced up at me, barely acknowledging my presence, while Sandy paused the TV, clearly annoyed that I was interrupting their precious prime time. "Can we talk for a minute?" I asked, trying to keep my tone even though I was already feeling frustrated. Sandy raised an eyebrow. "About what?" "About what's going to happen after my father passes," I said. I could feel the tension in the room instantly rise. The smiles and laughter vanished, and suddenly, all eyes were on me. Good. They needed to hear this. "I've been giving this some thought, and we need to talk about the house," I continued. "Specifically, about rent." "Rent?" Beth let out a disbelieving laugh. "What are you talking about?" I didn't let her interrupt. Once Dad's gone, things are going to change. If you want to continue living here, you're going to have to start paying rent. Rent? The word hung in the air like a ticking time bomb. Beth let out another incredulous laugh. What are you talking about? I didn't let her interrupt. Once Dad's gone, things are going to change. If you want to continue living here, you're going to have to start paying rent. I've spoken with a lawyer, and we've calculated a fair amount based on the market value of the house. Beth stared at me like I had just insulted her entire existence. Tina straightened up, ready to chime in with some snide remarks, but Sandy beat her to it. Wait a minute, Sandy said, narrowing her eyes. Why would we need to pay rent? James wanted us to stay here. I nodded, keeping my tone even. I know, but I've been covering the costs of this house for years, and that can't continue after he's gone. You've had a good run here for a long time, but things are going to have to change. You either start paying rent, or you'll have to find somewhere else to live. There was a dead silence in the room. I could see the wheels turning in Sandy's head as she tried to process what I was saying. Tina and Beth looked completely bewildered, as if the idea of paying rent had never even crossed their minds. Which, of course, it hadn't. Why would it, when they'd been living there for free? Finally, Sandy spoke, her voice sharp. Hold on a second, Sandy said, narrowing her eyes. Why would we need to pay rent? James wanted us to stay here. I clenched my fists, trying to maintain my composure. I know, but I've been covering the costs of this house for years, and that can't continue after he's gone. You've had a good run here for a long time, but things are going to have to change. You either start paying rent, or you'll have to move out. Those are your options. Tina finally jumped in, her face flushed red with anger. You're unbelievable, she spat. We've been living here for years, and now you want to make money off of us? What kind of person does that to family? I sighed, feeling the frustration building up inside me. I'm not trying to make money off of anyone, I said. I'm just trying to make sure things are handled fairly. I've given you plenty of time, and I'm giving you more time. 3 months after my father passes, you have 3 months to figure out what you're going to do. That's more than generous. Beth crossed her arms and glared at me. So, if we don't pay, you're just going to kick us out? I don't want it to come to that, I said, meeting her gaze. But if you're not willing to pay rent, then you'll have to leave. I can't keep covering the expenses for you. Sandy stood up, trying to play the victim. I can't believe you're doing this to us, she said. After everything we've done for James, after everything we've done for this family, you're just going to throw us out like we're nothing. I shook my head. I'm not throwing you out, I said. I'm giving you a choice. But like I said, things are going to change, and you need to be prepared for that. I'm giving you 3 months to figure things out. That's more than generous. I could see Tina getting ready to say something else, but I was done with the conversation. I'd said what I needed to say, and I wasn't about to stand there and argue with them all day. So, before they could pile on any more complaints or guilt trips, I turned and walked toward the door. As I left the house, I could still hear them arguing behind me, trying to figure out how to get out of this, but that wasn't my problem anymore. They'd been living in my father's house for free for years. It was time for them to face reality. Little did they know, the house wasn't even my father's. Update 2. So after I told Sandy and her daughters they would have to move out or start paying rent, I thought that would be the end of it. I mean, what else could they do? I had the law on my side, all the paperwork showed the house was mine, and I gave them ample time to figure things out. 3 months was fair, right? Well, apparently Sandy didn't think so, because guess what? She tried to sue me. Yes, Sandy actually went out and hired a lawyer and filed a lawsuit, claiming she had the right to stay in the house because she was my father's wife and had been promised the house after he passed. I almost laughed when I first heard about it. I was served the papers at work, and my first reaction was, you have got to be kidding me. I mean, what was she thinking? She knew I owned the house. I'd shown her the paperwork, talked to her calmly about it, even given her more time than most people would have to get her affairs in order, but apparently that wasn't enough. She decided to take it to court, thinking she would somehow win. Now, I've never been a fan of going to court, the whole process is just a headache, but at the same time, I wasn't worried. My lawyer was already lined up, and I knew we had everything we needed to shut this down before it even really got started. The first thing I did was call my lawyer. He was pretty nonchalant about it, probably because this kind of thing happens more often than you'd think. He looked over the documents Sandy had filed and said, yeah, this isn't going anywhere. They don't have a leg to stand on. But even knowing that, I was still furious that I had to deal with this at all. I mean, they'd been living in my house for free for years. What more did they want? The whole thing dragged on for a couple of months. Sandy made all these claims about my father promising her the house, even though there was no documentation or evidence to support it. She tried to play the grieving widow, acting like I was this evil guy throwing her out on the street. But the reality was, she had no legal claim to the house whatsoever. During the hearing, I had to sit there and listen to her lawyer try to spin this narrative about how Sandy and my father had planned for her to have the house after he died, and how much she had invested in making it a home. Yeah, right. Of course, she conveniently left out how she'd taken over the place, treated my father like a guest in his own home, and tried to get rid of Charlie, my father's dog, but of course, none of that came up. I mostly kept my cool. I knew the judge wouldn't buy it. My lawyer was doing a great job of shooting down every single claim Sandy's lawyer made. We had all the paperwork to prove the house was mine, the title deed, bank records, everything. So, every time they tried to bring up this supposed promise from my father, we hit them with cold, hard facts. One of the more ridiculous moments was when Sandy tried to claim she had made improvements to the house and that she was entitled to some kind of compensation. The house was in the same condition as when I bought it, if anything it was in worse shape because they hadn't taken care of it. My lawyer pointed this out, and the judge quickly dismissed that argument. To make matters even better, Sandy's daughters, Tina and Beth, actually showed up at court, acting like they were the victims in all of this. Tina tried to talk about how they'd been living there for years and it was their home, and I just sat there thinking, you've been living there for free, and now you're acting like I owe you something. I wanted to say something, but my lawyer gave me that let it go look, so I kept quiet. It didn't take the judge long to make his decision. He basically stated what we all knew: Sandy had no claim to the house. There was no will, no written agreement, nothing to indicate that my father had ever promised her the house. Since the house was legally mine, Sandy and her daughters would have to move out. I wish I could say I was surprised, but honestly, I wasn't. I knew this is how it would end. The whole lawsuit was just a desperate attempt for them to hold on to something they never had a right to in the first place. The judge gave them a final deadline: 2 weeks to vacate the premises, or eviction proceedings would begin. As we walked out of the courtroom, Sandy didn't even look at me. She just stormed off with Tina and Beth trailing behind her, acting like I'd done something terrible to them. But I didn't feel bad. I'd given them more time and more chances than they deserved, and they still tried to screw me over. In the end, they had no choice. After the court ruling, they packed up their things and left. I haven't heard from them since. No more phone calls, no more text messages, nothing. It's like they vanished, and honestly, I'm relieved. The whole thing has been a nightmare, but it's finally over. The house is finally mine, and I don't have to deal with their drama anymore. It was a long and exhausting process, but I finally won, and Sandy lost. She tried to sue me, but she lost. Now the house is mine, and they are gone for good. Honestly, that's all I ever wanted.